I just want to thank the co-conveners of the European Association for Social Anthropology and the Anthropology and Mobility Network team for inviting me to share my work today, and especially to Elise Hian-Marsang and Sonia Rude for their patience with me while organizing this talk, and their support of the Cuban people and dedication to Cuban studies during this current humanitarian crisis. So I'd like to start by just situating my fieldwork in revolutionary Cuba. And it must be remembered and restated that the 1959 Cuban Revolution was waged as an affront to US imperial dominance over the island, and thus has continued to be the target of violent political and economic assaults by the US government. Even as the expressed intent of US sanctions has been to induce regime change, thus far it's only been effective at collectively punishing everyday Cuban citizens on the ground. Due to the internal racialized class inequalities unresolved by the revolutionary project, Cuba's working class Afro-descendant population has always experienced the crippling effect of the weaponization of US economic sanctions most acutely sooner than the rest of the population. This is especially evident in Havana, Cuba, the capital city, which is the site of my fieldwork. So I conducted ethnographic research just after the iconic Cuban revolutionary leader, Fidel Castro, stepped down from power nearly 50 years in office due to declining health. In 2007, his brother, Raul Castro, was just beginning his new role as president of the Cuban Republic and leader of the Cuban Communist Party. The transfer of presidency and party leadership to Raul Castro marks the inception of this current era called Post-Fidel Cuba. Raul famously stated in his first speech as acting president, quote, "Revolution means having a sense of our moment in history. It means changing all that ought to be changed." And as pledged, in 2010, Raul Castro launched the so-called update to the political economy of the revolution. Here you see in Spanish, it's called the actualización del modelo económico. And this was designed to perfect the Cuban Revolution for the 21st century. These updates intensified a gradual shift away from the Soviet political economic model, which proved no longer viable for facing the demands of increased incorporation into global circuits of capital. So we see the state at this point explicitly striving to emulate a Sino-Vietnamese model. And by that, I mean it retained a powerful single-party state that controls strategic sectors of the economy while sharing other sectors with domestic and foreign private capitalists. That year, the Cuban Communist Party published guidelines to implement 130 new policies, create 344 new legal regulations, modify 555 existing regulations, and eliminate 684 regulations. The sum total of these changes were lauded by the Obama administration for how they expanded the private market. The reforms also normalized economic inequality by cutting government subsidies. So spending for social welfare decreased by 386 million. There were mass layoffs that occurred in the public sector, and already existing racialized inequalities worsened. The shrunken public sector went hand in hand with the government discourse encouraging the cultivation of entrepreneurialism among the citizenry, aided by the legalization of the right for Cubans to exploit the labor of other Cubans, as opposed to the state being the sole employer. My ethnography helps readers understand how that which was regarded as progress from the perspective of the US government under Obama, or perfection from the perspective of the Cuban Communist Party, felt like a regression in terms of quality of life for Black and poor Cubans on the ground. Categorically speaking, Black Cubans, due to their overrepresentation among the poorest classes before the revolution, had been the biggest benefactors of the state programs that were put on the chopping block post-Fidel. My book analyzes the racialized and gendered impacts of these reforms and how a working class community in Havana drew on African-inspired epistemologies to assess and address both new and old socioeconomic challenges. Living in Havana from 2012 to 2014, and during 6 postdoctoral research trips between 2016 and 2022, I bore witness to how this Black community endeavored to sustain itself during the updates rollout. And specifically, I draw attention to the practice of Black popular dance as a window into how ancestral and initiatic modes of relation, once constructed by the enslaved, have been adapted by their descendants to remediate and reconfigure gender-specific racial constraints of the post-Fidel era. And so this, what you'll see on the screen is a clipping from Gramma, the official newspaper of the Cuban Communist Party, and it is kind of really promoting this idea of self-employment, trabajo por cuenta propia, and can really kind to encourage people to go into this sphere of the economy. And then on the left side, you'll see a picture that I took also during 2010 on the street. It's a poster that was created, um, advertising courses, basically marketing courses, like ways, techniques of selling, right? That's what the direct translation. But it kind of gives you a sense of the fervor at this time of both people on the ground and also the state really trying to take on or refashion themselves in this to be private sector workers. Importantly, the same year Raúl took office, Spain passed its law of historical memory, under which any Cuban national able to trace a grandparent or great-grandparent in their family to Spain were eligible to be granted Spanish citizenship based on jus sanguinis, or in Latin, the right of the blood. Therefore, white Cubans capitalizing on their new birthright to dual European citizenship had an advantageous footing as Raúl's update took effect. To be of Spanish descent with an EU passport opened up a slew of opportunities for white class mobility, including ease of travel abroad without a visa, the option to legally emigrate to Europe and work abroad while still owning property in Cuba and sending remittances to their families on the island, and even enrolling their children in private schools once restricted to family of diplomats. And a really good book for this is Hope Bastion's ethnography, Adjusting to the Adjustments, which goes into all the changes that took place socially during this time. On the day the first EU passports were issued in 2009, recipients in Cuba were quoted as being grateful that their Spanish ancestors had given them this life-changing opportunity and shouting, "Long live Spain," words that would have been socially scorned in the days of revolutionary fervor under Fidel. When the first white Cuban to be granted dual citizenship enthusiastically readied himself to retrace the voyage across the Atlantic by plane that his great-grandfather made by ship, Cubans of African descent braced for a reversion of a different kind. Rumba, a Black working-class form of popular music and dance, I argue, offers a unique and important vantage to learn more about the insurgent placemaking of those who, since colonialism, created their communities in surroundings that were hostile to the fullness of their humanity and under political systems that deemed their social practices as abject, excessive, or categorically out of place. Building on Harney and Moten's conceptualization of the undercommons for Black study, I'm moved to think about the kinds of social relations that enable the sharing of both material and affective resources within a larger project of Black self-determination. Thinking with Rumba, I put forth this idea of a Black corporeal undercommons to highlight the kind of embodied labor that goes into constructing an alternative space of relation formed within the Black working class that has real material implications for how a changing socioeconomic landscape is experienced in the everyday. The epilogue to my book recounts my post-pandemic return visit to the island in December of 2022. in the midst of what has become the largest Cuban migration wave in all of nation's history. And you'll see it's the December of 2022 is the tallest bar in the graph. At that time, it was an exodus of more than 300,000 people, totaling more than the 5 years prior combined. I witnessed people anxiously selling all of their belongings on the black market for US dollars to pay for coyotes to guide them through Central America to the US, or risk making the perilous journey by raft. Even the white middle class and nouveau riche sector who had experienced social mobility since Raul Castro's expansion of the private market, even they had begun to flee in search of the growing number of things, both material and immaterial, that they were convinced were not available in Cuba anymore. The latest migration numbers total over 1 million people. But even last year's numbers show that migrants in this wave surpassed the total of all other migration waves in Cuba's modern history combined. Even more clear to me during my most recent visit to Havana this past December, the current exodus is not just propelled by an economic crisis, but a crisis of faith. Since the pandemic lockdowns in 2020, the loss of faith among Cubans and the state's ability to foster a decent life on the island has spread like a virus. And back in 2022, that would be the COVID virus. But now, the most recent trip, the chikungunya virus is the one that is spreading like wildfire, similarly to the loss of faith in the state. And while many nations have been able to recover a sense of normalcy after the pandemic, given the plummet of tourism and Trump's policies to block the influx of remittances, Cubans can still no longer rely on even the limited social safety net they had come to expect. Foods like rice, bread, goods like soap, medicines like antibiotics or ibuprofen, and probably most devastating, again, reminding today, amenities or services like electricity and therefore water are scarce. Many in Cuba compare the economic conditions since the pandemic with the special period of the 1990s, when Cuba was catapulted into a historic depression of wartime austerity after the fall of the Soviet Union, and they agree that current conditions are far worse. The newest executive order declaring Cuba a national threat to the US has instituted a de facto blockade, which would ordinarily, under international law, be considered an act of war. What has resulted is the collective punishment of the Cuban people who live in a pervasive state of anguish and despair, starved of the means to sustain life. Today, there is no legal pathway for entry to the US, but staying put feels just as, or perhaps even more risky than leaving. In the 1960s, Che Guevara's template for the new man, the ideal subject of the Cuban Revolution, was a man without class position, racial identification, or religious affiliation, who engaged in selfless acts of duty for the collective good. If to be a Cuban revolutionary meant to believe in the power of collective action to make a place in the here and now more hospitable to the dignity of working people, then my book precisely zeroes in on how a similar force of faith is embodied in collective movement, in the collective movement of the descendants of the enslaved in Cuba, who choreograph an embodied place for sustaining collective life and defend that ground against persistent incursions. So rather than being a book about rumba per se, it takes rumba as a way of knowing, leading me to make 3 claims. The first, that rumberos, rumba practitioners, sustain a corporal commons wherein they exchange resources in self-affirming terms that challenge the race, gendered, and class indignities that characterize post-Fidel Cuba. 2, this commons cannot be understood or entered outside of the embodied politics and poetics of the sacred. And 3, while serving as a refuge from intersectional oppressions on the one hand, it nonetheless reproduced and rationalized forms of gender inequities within its space that practitioners still choose to defend as their own. These three claims allow me to debunk the common presupposition in Cuban studies that positions the Cuban Revolution as the culmination of the formerly enslaved political aspirations, as if to be included within the national project or to be a full citizen was all the formerly enslaved wanted to become. This is not to invisibilize the contribution and even leadership of Black people in Cuban revolutionary movements from colonialism to the present, nor diminish the positive impact of socialist reforms on all poor Cubans. However, if allowed serious consideration beyond the folkloric, Rumba points us toward a sector of the Black urban poor that strives to maintain a critical distance from statist logics and national interpolations. In the Cuban context, the word rumba signals a diversity of music and dance styles that have taken on new meanings over time. Dating to the mid-19th century, a rumba was a social event, distinguished by live percussion, song, and dance, giving cultural expression to a social practice that linked African people and peoples of African descent in colonial Western Cuba. What would become the distinguishing characteristics of rumba in Cuba were consolidated in the urban slums of the western cities of Havana and Matanzas by the formerly enslaved. It is in this context that rumba is said to have established its function as what Leonora Acosta called a social chronicle of the dispossessed. Indeed, rumberos or practitioners of rumba describe what they do as forming a conversation or continuing a dialogue that started during slavery. Anthropologist Yvonne Daniels' path-breaking scholarship on rumba has shown how its aesthetics and kinesthetics enable communication across social borders and between human and spiritual agents, what I refer to in my book as the more than human. The ethnography is anchored by the 16 members of the rumba ensemble Yoruba Ndao, a name which they say means friend or member of the Yoruba people. I began training under Yoruba Ndawo's dance director, dance director Jenny Said Galata, pictured sitting at the front of the stage here, during my prior career as a professional dancer. This was years before beginning my graduate degree in anthropology. Jenny Said's network spanned across numerous professional rumba ensembles based in Havana that, by extension, also became my teachers. I learned that they attributed their ability to make a dignified livelihood amidst economic change neither to the state nor to the private market, but to their faith. By faith, I'm specifically talking about their community of kin to African diaspora divinities. Aisha Beliso de Jesus has called these same sacred energies co-presences, for they are, in her words, recognized as being on, around, and within the practitioners' bodies, and are felt and sensed through embodiment linked to a racial consciousness. Quote, this ritual repertoire was consolidated by the descendants of the enslaved, trafficked to Cuba in the 18th and 19th century. In Cuba, it is known as regla de ocha, or ifa, or lukumi, or simply the Yoruba religion. And those in the US and maybe in Europe might be familiar with its popular name, Santeria. Jenny and all members of Yoruba Ndao belongs to a familia de piedra, or a family of stone, which means they invested in a shared web of rights and obligations to divinities birthed into stone and cared for collectively through embodied ritual. Through these practices of bodying forth co-presence, the enslaved and their descendants effectively recreated family structures once decimated by the slave trade. The ritual labor of creating and caring for the divinities of their homelands underpinned a sense of belonging to each other and systems of reciprocity and accountability for each other's well-being in the midst of brutal conditions of chattel slavery. Key is how their practice of self-making reject the idea of a sovereign individual upon which the notion of the entrepreneurial neoliberal subject is based, and instead insist upon their interdependence with each other as ritual kin and their critical reliance on co-presences, the more than human, to order their steps and shape their fate. In many ways, such a project is out of place in what we think of as revolutionary Cuba, where both religious faith and racial affiliation were specifically targeted for elimination. Both religion and race were seen by the revolutionary vanguard as maladaptations to pre-revolutionary life plagued by racial capitalism. However, socialism did not make the sacred racial consciousness obsolete. And, as I saw during my research, subsequent cuts to the social safety net over time have only made it more vital. In chapter 1, I start in the colonial period when Rumba events were viewed as primitive but tolerated, then follow how they were criminalized in the early republic, and then I trace how a sanitized and secularized repertoire of Afro-Cuban dance was ultimately permitted for inclusion on the national stage through the professionalization of rumberos as folkloric artists. Rather than framing the story of rumba and the Cuban Revolution as one of racial uplift, I put forth the utility of framing it as one of Black enclosure. And here I'm thinking with this idea of enclosure put forth by Damien Joyner's work. The subsequent chapters analyze how rumberos practice fugitive choreographies in pursuit of more dignified life within that enclosure. Each chapter shows how choreographies of fugitivity are embodied while negotiating the markedly raced and gendered effects and affects of a supposedly more perfect Cuban socialism. Chapter 2 does this with the focus on Black women's feminist theorizing in motion. Then chapter 3 focuses specifically on how young Black men position themselves differently vis-a-vis this new man 2.0. It's just the name that I'm giving the updated ideal subject of post-Fidel revolutionary Cuba, the private business owner. And then the analytical focus widens in chapter 4 to show how rumberos are situated within broader networks of trade, linking Havana's poorest Black neighborhoods and extending to kin that reside abroad. Chapter 5 is a meditation on the kind of fugitive assembly pushed for at Rumba events and how they run up against the gentrification of the city. In each chapter, rather than making appeals to the state, rumberos and rumberas dance around its gaze to defend a space of social relation with the more than human that they call their own. And I call this space a Black corporeal undercommons, a kind of geography found in choreography. This critical attention to how space is bodied forth has been a key contribution of both dance studies and Black feminist geography. So my methodological route to this theorization involved actually undergoing intensive long-term dance training, which made all the difference. If I had only based my understanding on observations or verbal accounts, I would have missed the ways that rumberas and rumberos consciously play with and obfuscate those regimes of knowing through their embodied practice. And my work joins a strong current within Black feminist anthropology that is taking dance seriously as a way of knowing and a mode of political praxis. So in the time that remains, I want to go backwards in time before delving into a few of my ethnographic leanings from post-Fidel Havana. And this look back to the colonial period helps to clarify how I'm thinking about the corporeal and in relation to the undercommons and fugitivity. The famed father of Cuban anthropology, Fernando Ortiz, called 19th century newspapers, memoirs, and travelogues and quoted them at length in his 20th century studies of what he termed the Afro-Cuban underworld, and later recast as Afro-Cuban culture. These quotes are taken from his 1920 essay where he traces Rumba's roots to the colonial King's Day processions. These colonial accounts tell of Black people's bodily expressions wreaking havoc on the senses of European aesthetic sensibilities. The reference to them dancing in their different groups refers to the cabildos de nación, or the associations of free and enslaved people of African descent, loosely grouped according to African language and approximate region of capture in Africa. The most prominent cabildos were those of the Lukumi, who encompass the Yoruba-speaking people, the cabildos Congo, referencing the Kikongo-speaking people, and Carabali, referring to the Efik-speaking people hailing from the Cross River Delta region. So colonial slave masters knew that Africans were not a homogeneous, undifferentiated mass. But unlike the British system of slavery, Spanish law allowed for the organization of these ethnic associations. And to be clear, this should not be mistaken as a benevolent act of cultural respect. Officializing distinct African ethnic identities was part of a deliberate effort to deter the bonds of cross-ethnic solidarity necessary for mass revolt. In 1790, the slave owner Miguel de Moya wrote to His Majesty that the Blacks are, quote, inclined to dance in the barbarous styles of their countries, and if this right is denied them, it will cause irresistible pain and produce bad consequences. He was able to gather the signatures of almost all of the masters of sugar plantations in this jurisdiction in this petition to give the enslaved the right to celebrate such holidays on the explicit grounds of saving themselves, the planters, from the enslaved collective resentment. You see, Cuban planters saw the Haitian Revolution as a reaction to a regime that excessively curbed other forms of social outlet. Once the Cuban planter class arose as the major world producer of sugar, they did not want to risk prohibiting what Ortiz called this illusion of freedom while dancing. On the day of Holy Kings, the 6th of January, the cabildos were permitted to parade the streets. The processions were said to have darkened the built environment of Havana, spilling through the streets like, in the second quote, it says, like a black cloud over the city. And yet, these repugnant spectacles of African cultural diversity, to the estimation of white elites, would ensure the cathartic release of a pressure valve, so the enslaved would continue to, as you see in the last sentence here, would continue to bear the bitterness of their existence. End quote. In effect, the colonial archive of Rumba inscribes a common sense about how to understand and observe Black people dancing, filtered through what historian Aisha Finch has called white's colonial myopia. In her study of the Escalera Rebellion of 1843 to 1844, Finch argues that this perception of Black dance as simply feverish fantasy play made it possible for insurgents to hide in plain sight. For instance, cabildos would bestow royal titles like king or queen on cabildo members, often based on specific roles in slave rebellions in the making. So the King's Day processions would be when they unveiled who had been elected to play which parts to those in the know. Indeed, the collective political imaginary of the cabildo membership far exceeded what the colonial regime had calculated. Matt Child's history of the Aponte Rebellion of 1812 shows that, contrary to what masters could perceive, cabildo processions were not moments of distraction from structural oppression, but instead served political, ideological, economic, and spiritual purposes for their constituencies. Within the cabildo governance structure, the importance placed on African language and customs, and specifically the social value placed on being African-born, reversed the colonial structure of social hierarchy that privileged proximity to whiteness. So far from dampening Black aspirations for freedom, they saw their participation in the cabildo as a pathway to both individual and collective liberation. Cabildo functions were occasions for fundraising, for mutual aid, collecting fees and donations from members and spectators alike to provide health care, boarding, burial expenses, funds for coartación, which is self-paid manumission, and networks for the care of fugitives. Moments of dance drumming during enslavement such as these, as in Brazil, have been called spaces of refuge in thunder, and I'm here quoting Rachel Harding, or alternative spaces of Blackness. Whereas autonomous Maroon communities were indeed established in Cuba by fleeing slavery and escaping to isolated rural spaces set apart from dominant society, which is how Maranaj is commonly figured in Black studies, cabildos were embedded in the urban landscape of the colonial capital, hiding in plain sight. In this formulation, popular dance cues us to an alternate urban space in which Black people, remade into families of stone, dwelled during colonialism, where viable networks of support and accountability were sustained in place. So while the processions of the cabildos on King's Day may have only ephemerally changed the sense of place for whites, like a black cloud over the city that comes and then disappears, the choreographies of the cabildos allowed the formerly enslaved to situate themselves differently in social relation in enduring ways. On this basis, I understand the Black corporeal undercommons as a set of social relations that extended beyond the physical walls of the cabildo or even the space-time of the procession or cultural performance proper, to more generally include a choreogeography of Black cooperative sociality over time. Later in chapter 1, I track how rumba became institutionalized after the Cuban Revolution of 1959 as an exalted symbol of egalitarianism. What better than the popular dances of the formerly enslaved to represent the proletariats who freed themselves from the shackles of US foreign rule, right? This was the subject of the only other book on rumba published 30 years ago by Yvonne Daniel, whose work I'm indebted to and honor with an epigraph to every chapter. Daniel trained with the National Folkloric Dance Company, which you see pictured here. Nationalizing the dances of the Black corporeal undercommons, however, came attendant with strict policing and criminalization of its excesses. This was expressed in the violent persecution of African-inspired religious practice and Black consciousness. Importantly, the revolutionary government's adoption of colorblind ideology in its rewriting of the law rendered Black mutual aid societies illegal. And Robin Moore terms this process nationalizing Blackness to highlight how Black inclusion and anti-Black racism went hand in hand rather than being opposing forces. On this historical basis, I theorize this uplift and professionalization of rumba under the auspices of Cuban state institutions as a mechanism of state-driven Black enclosure. Tellingly, when the UN designated 2011 as the year of people of African descent at the peak of the reforms, the Cuban state's response was for the Ministry of Culture to officially recognize rumba as national patrimony and showcase rumba performance during nationally televised events. In 2016, Cuban rumba made it to the UNESCO list of intangible cultural heritage. This high-profile recognition of rumba created a double bind. In order to be considered dignified while dancing, rumberos had to be framed as dancing for the nation. I accompanied rumba practitioners as they negotiated what they experienced as conflicting pulls on their time and labor. On the one hand, they were obligated as professional folkloric artists to be at the beck and call of the Ministry of Culture in exchange for a state salary of roughly $20 a month. And rumberos called these gigs trabajos diplomáticos, or diplomatic work, recognizing it as a form of cultural diplomacy geared toward foreigners and the broader Cuban citizenry, for which you receive symbolic compensation. And this picture is an example of one of this kind of trabajo diplomático done in 2016, while actually Fidel's casket was being brought from Havana to Santiago de Cuba and kind of commemorating his life, they put on a rumba por Fidel. At the same time, rumberos sought ways to invest their labor in what they called trabajo religioso, or religious work. And religious work is how obligations to the divine through their families of stone were fulfilled. In Cuba, these direct cash payments for religious work are called derechos, which literally translate into English as rights, as in a sum of money or material compensation that a person has a right to, conferred to them through the divine. And I'm making this contrast between kind of the right of the blood conferred, which is for citizenship via Spain, versus these kinds of derechos, which is conferred through the divine to those of African ancestry, as opposed to the other one, which is conferred through Spanish ancestry, underwritten by the law and nation state building. According to Rumbas, this was the kind of work that sustained their families amid the rising cost of living in Havana. Laboring shoulder to shoulder with family of stone ensured that money is kept in circulation rather than accumulated. So, chapter 4 focuses in on the economics of these familial networks of exchange within which Rumba artists labor. And chapter 2 and 3 flesh out what is at stake for differently gendered rumberos who seek refuge in the spiritually guided domain of trade. These gendered impacts have largely been underexplored within the scholarship and activism around racialized class inequality in post-Fidel Cuba. And one way I think about this in chapter 2 is how the juridical opening for Cubans to employ other Cubans not only strengthened a white middle class, but fueled the resurgence of the domestic service industry. Officially regarded as a vestige of Cuban slave society, revolutionary leaders once celebrated their eradication of domestic service after 1959, when social programs targeting working class women empowered them to labor for the state. And these are referencing a book by Rachel Hinson, which is excellent about this history. By contrast, Anasa Hicks writes about how during the Raúl administration, white middle-class families explicitly sought out women of African descent as domestics, where they were disproportionately vulnerable to sexual abuse and wage theft. I've written elsewhere how during fieldwork, my own body was not exempt from the effects of this grammar in slavery's wake. More than just learning steps from women Rumba dancers, I learned how Rumba factored into their conscious calculation of the constrained and demeaning openings available to them for inclusion in the expanding private market. In a focus group with Rumberas after class one day, they lamented the kinds of humiliations they faced when looking for employment. Silvia, the dance director of the Rumba ensemble Grupo Afroamérica, summed up the unfair playing field in 2 words, drawn out for emphasis. Racismo profesional, professional racism. Then she put on a deep voice and stuck out her chest and widened her elbows to imitate a man in charge. No, shooing me away as a dark-skinned Black woman. Give me a tall mulata, a mixed-race woman. While professional Rumba dancing was a way to avoid domestic service, for instance, when auditioning for dance parts in tourist-facing nightclubs, Sylvia is talking about how Black women's bodies were similarly appraised based on those who had the potential to appeal to the imagined desires of male patrons. So limited in their access to self and well-paid work in the private sector, Rumberas spoke about relying on their faith to guide them in choreographing more sustainable, affirming possibilities with their family of stone. And this is a picture of an all-women's Rumba group, Rumba Morena. And the formation of these all-women groups is a testament also to the kind of gendered inequities that are experienced within their communities. So I'm not saying that the Black Undercommons is some sort of feminist utopia, but it is a field in which women feel that they had more faith in their ability to maneuver than the private sector or the state sector. In the case of Yerilu Ibaye, sacred guidance led her away from laboring for the state and the private market alike. She attributed her decision to ultimately leave the Conjunto Folclórico Nacional de Cuba, the National Folkloric Dance Company, for Yuruandao, to her frustration as a new mom and her dutifulness as a daughter of Obatala, the divinity associated with the mountains. Being a member of the National Folkloric Company meant that she was constantly called on for diplomatic gigs that paid little in return. This left little time and not enough money to care for her new baby that she excitedly showed me pictures of on her phone. Jerilu vividly recounted the day that she was shown the path she should take at this professional crossroads. During a ceremony marking the anniversary of her Lukumi initiation, a message from a divinity of the crossroads, Elegua, came demanding that she dedicate herself to singing in religious ceremonies in her community, or she would lose her voice and never sing again. understanding her well-being as intimately tied to the claim divine forces had on her body, she took the message seriously. Joining Yuruandao represented a way to still get paid for her artistry while heeding the divine's call to also prioritize religious work. "Do you know what I feel every time I sing?" she asked me. "It's like a magnetic field around my body, a field in which the only thing that exists is the percussion, the dancer, and myself, a field that covers us, that protects us." An intersectional analysis of the field she described allows us to understand the specificity of what draws Black working class women to protect themselves from the injuries that the revolution was supposed to have once saved them from. This space of human and more than human endeavor reconfigures their relationship to the very grounds seeded by the Cuban state's formulation of an updated socialism. Jenny similarly attested to being guided in her labor decisions by divinity. But in her case, the message she received from Elegua influenced her choreographic choices when Yurandabo performed in state-owned nightclubs patroned by Black locals rather than tourists. Midway through the show, Yurandabo shifted to playing music from the Cabildo-based liturgical repertoires. The dancers changed into costumes representing different divinities. Guernicel was renowned for her choreographic interpretation of Yemaya, the divinity of the ocean. And almost immediately, she would be approached by religious audience members who eagerly took the opportunity to tuck a bill into her costume, either underneath the rim of her headpiece or inside her neck collar. And rather than carrying a flirtatious connotation, this practice is a public demonstration of personal devotion to the divinity represented by the dancer. In exchange for this derecho, Jenny performed a cleansing typically reserved for ceremony and mutual recognition of their sacred relation through the same co-presences. And I'm going to show a short clip of this happening during a nightclub. So even if it is a staged performance deemed secular, this derecho, this right to reciprocity between the divinity and their child, extended to wherever this choreography take place. And at one show, Jenny could earn upwards of $50, more than twice her monthly state salary. And as the primary breadwinner of her family, this is no small change. When I asked Zulema, another dancer in Yurubandabo and a daughter of Oshun, the riverine divinity, if this extended duration of their dance solos due to all the audience and interaction ever posed a problem for the venue management, she explained, quote, "We are religious. So when that part comes, everyone knows that the musicians have to keep playing to give people the time to salute and dance with you. And if anything, they shorten the rest of the show so that they can still end at the scheduled time." So I took this defense of a hard boundary of being religious, where state's interest may not intrude, as a cue to be more curious about the kinds of public actions that become possible and justified when done not in protest, but in the register of prayer. What if the blurriness of the line between personal choice and spiritual will in public spaces such as these is not framed as catharsis, but as a choreography of fugitivity in motion? To conclude, it cannot be overstated the degree to which the Cuban government's development designs have been limited by weakened economic allies and plagued by intensified US sanctions post-Fidel. But Silvia, the rumbera who talked to us earlier about racismo profesional, reminds us not to let nostalgia for the golden years under Fidel cloud our ability to see how this kind of choreography was deemed out of step with the Cuban revolutionary state's vision of progress from the beginning. In chapter 5, I recount the story she told me when I asked her where she learned rumba. And she talked about the cabildo that she grew up in the countryside, through which she proudly traced her lineage all the way back to slavery. Sylvia was the first generation in her family to go to college, which created a path for social mobility that she owes to the revolution. But a revolutionary education did not replace her sense of duty to her ancestors. Sylvia would never forget the day she returned home from college in one year in early adulthood to pay respect to her great-grandmother on the anniversary of her death, who was buried in the cabildo of her hometown. She put her hand on her chest and paused, silently remembering the visceral impact of finding that the cabildo had been bulldozed and replaced with a row of public houses. According to the urban planners carrying out the revolution's reforms, these collectively owned buildings of worship were not an efficient use of public space. And by the same token, prayer was not a productive use of time. Sylvia's voice cracked when she implored the next generation to defend rumba, indexing the scars left by ancestral indignities committed alongside revolutionary triumph in the afterlife of slavery. This is not dancing for dancing's sake. Esto no es bailar por bailar, Jenny Seld emphasized to me during her classes when I missed a cue in the music. And I also take it as a cue to always question the institutionalized colonial myopic frameworks that govern our knowledge production and political imagination. Rather than look to officials or political leaders, a Black feminist attunement to rumba asks us to take seriously how everyday people, formed by a sense of shared fate with the more than human, find creative ways to repurpose their bodies, the very site of their subjection, to create other choices. Rumba can teach us that putting one's body in motion with the kin we create makes it feel more possible to move beyond the constrained terms of progress, citizenship, and conventional party politics. I offer the Black corporeal undercommons then as a framework for thinking diasporically about how and from where the formerly enslaved summon the will to defend the places they need to sustain collective prayers for a place more hospitable to dignified life. Thank you.